Welcome to the Six Figure Influencer Podcast. I am so happy you are here. Today, I am going to share wisdom in hindsight with you regarding my podcast, which is something that I've talked about here and there in the podcast, but something that I've been getting more and more questions about. And it's honestly like great timing because here lately we have seen some insane traction with the podcast. Just in the past few months, I would say this year in 2022, we've just, that was cool. I said 2022 at minute 222. Cool. Anyway, as far as the program that I'm recording this on, it might not be the right time for you in this. Anyway, okay. My mind. This is how my brain works. Anyway, yeah, we've seen some really cool traction. We've been hitting some charts. And it's just, I've been sharing this in my stories lately, but it's like surprising in some ways because that's never been my goal. Like when I share the podcast, when I started the podcast, I never even thought that I would be a podcast that charts or a podcast that like actually competes with big names and other big shows. That's never been my goal. It's really still not even my goal. I mean, it's fun. So on one hand, when we do chart and when we do find our name high up on some really big lists, like Apple Business, which are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasts there. And, on the Apple's list for entrepreneurship podcasts, it's genuinely a pleasant surprise for me. And at the same time, part of me is also like, but of course we're charting because I feel like the conversations here lately anyway, have been just something about them has been even more powerful and potent. I feel like I have been able to tap into a level of confidence and a level of truth and wisdom and knowledge in myself. And I've gained the confidence to actually like show up and talk about the things that I actually want to talk about. And so much of this credit goes to you for tuning in each week and listening loyally and sharing and just being like so wonderful and like being the best audience I could even ask for. So it's like part of it is like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And also the other part of it is like, yeah, that it makes sense because I take this very seriously. I take these conversations and the things that I share. I don't talk about anything that I genuinely don't do and that I genuinely don't believe in. I don't do interviews with people just because they're popular and just because I think it's going to get me clout or downloads. Like everything is so intentional here. And the fact that is actually getting me somewhere versus being super, super what you would consider strategic, like booking a ton of collaborations and a ton of interviews with a ton of big names. And, and that being your sole strategy, it's really cool. So I wanted to come on here because now that we are seeing this level of traction and we're charting, and I've seen what this is doing for my business because that's important too. Like you might be thinking like, who cares? Like, what does it mean to even chart? Because to the listener, it really means nothing except that you probably find a lot of the podcasts that you listen to from perusing other charts, right? Like whenever you're looking and you want to listen to a new podcast, you're going to look at charts. And if it could be the best podcast in the world or the exact thing that you're looking for. But if they're not in top 100 or top 50 of a chart, you'll never know about them unless somebody else shares it with you. So, but besides that, as a consumer, that means absolutely nothing to you. But the reason why I'm sharing it here is because so many of you are business owners or aspiring business owners, and so many of you are on the fence on whether or not you should start your own podcast, or maybe you've started one before and you kind of fell off, or maybe you have one now, but you haven't really quite found your stride. And I wanted to bring this conversation here because I've seen what the podcast has done for my own business. And anything that works for my business, I come and I share with you because if it feels aligned, I want you to test it out for yourself. And I made a post today, and I think I worded it perfectly. Like, starting this podcast 3 years in now, I can say has been one of the top best business decisions I've ever made, top 3 at least. Not because I'm now charting, that's only recently, but because even far before I was charting, far before, so many of you found me from the podcast. So many of like my dream listeners and women that I just want in my world, because like we speak the same language, we see each other, like we get each other, the things that we talk about and the things that we believe in, and the strategies that we do, for the most part, it vibes. Like we vibe with each other, and so many of you have found me through the podcast, and I want that for you too. If that's something that you're looking for, a way to build credibility for yourself, and you're looking for a way to be exposed to more people, podcasting isn't the only option to do that, but it's a great one. And I'm very biased, but, and again, you may be thinking I'm saying this because now we're charting, but I would have said this a year ago, because I mean, even before we found this traction, like I was still being discovered. So you don't even have to hit super, super low or, high on a chart to be discovered. People were finding me well before I was top 100 anything. So what I want to share with you today are, like, now that I'm 3 years in, and now that I've tried so many different strategies, I've learned so many different things. If I could do anything differently, what would those things be? Because that's super powerful information, right? Because if you are newer to the podcast space, or you are thinking of diving in, you probably want to know this information, right? Like I wish I knew the 3 things that I'm going to share with you in this podcast. I wish I knew 3 years ago, because who knows where the podcast will be today. So again, this is just the wisdom as somebody who's been doing this for 3 years, very consistently, every single week without fail, with the exception of like 3 weeks. Here's what I would do differently. Now, before we get into that, I do in episode 145 there, it's called Should You Start a Podcast? I think that's the title. In that episode, I share my story, like my full story on how I got started with this podcast. And I share pros and cons of podcasting. So if you want more of this conversation after this, listen to this first, and then go back and listen to episode 145 if you're just curious how I got started. Because I share all the time that 3 years ago when I started this podcast, number 1, I had no freaking clue what I was doing. Number 2, I was like an ounce of the business owner that I am now, talking about business. And number 3, what was the number 3? I was awful. That's number 3. I was like the worst podcaster on the planet. And I'm not saying that to be funny. I'm certain I was like, when I first got started, I was the worst. And I've shared that I used to like script every single episode. The full journey, I've walked it. I crawled so you could run. Okay. So you can go and you can listen to that episode. but I want you to listen to that if you haven't yet, because you can look at me now and you might be thinking like, of course she has a podcast and of course she's charting, because you hear these episodes, you hear the result of 3 years of weekly practice. Okay. I don't even know what the math is of that. What episode are we on? I think this is episode 159 or 160, what it will be. Um, so you're hearing, let's just say 160 episodes of practice. And let's just say like the beginning, it wasn't like that, of course. So I just don't want you to see my end product and compare yourself now and think that like, unless you show up in this way, that then you shouldn't do it, because like you have to get started at some point. And I'm, like I said, it's one of the best business decisions I've ever made. And if you're comfortable with sucking for a while and potentially being the worst one out there until you find your stride, then I say freaking go for it. Now, like I said, in this episode, I'm going to share with you the 3 things that if I could go back in time, I would do a little bit differently, which is going to be really powerful. Next Thursday, or no, this Thursday, as you listen to this Thursday, May 19th, 2022, I am hosting a masterclass where I am sharing with you the 3 codes to unlock your chart ranking podcast. So in the masterclass, I'm sharing like now, again, looking back over the past 3 years, now that like we're actually charting, we're actually like, I used to be discovered by clients before. Now I'm like really getting discovered. Now I can say, okay, how did I get here? And I share the 3 codes, like the 3 things that I know I did really, really well that have started, that were the catalysts for the traction that I'm seeing now. So if you are a current podcaster or an aspiring podcaster, or you're just curious how this happened, please join us this Thursday, May 19th. You are going to learn in an hour what took me 3 years to figure out. It's going to be honest. It's going to be juicy. It is free. And even if you're listening to this in the future and you might have, passed May 19th, still go to that link, because we're going to do something with that recording and hopefully you'll still be able to watch it. But if you can watch it in real time, definitely do. And I hope to see you there. Okay. So 3 years in, 6-figure influencer podcast. What would I do differently if I could go back in time? And these things they came to me pretty quickly. Like I knew pretty instantly, okay, yeah, I would do these things. And I'll share with you why for each. Number 1, first thing, and this might shock some of you, I would have chosen a different name. Now, I posted on my stories, it's been a couple weeks now, that I was thinking of changing the name of the podcast for a few different reasons, which we'll get into. And many of you had very strong opinions about this. And many of you are like, why would you change it? I love the name. It's so good. Da, da, da. And I agree with you. I love the name. I chose the name. And I'm attached to the name, right? Like 6-figure influence. It's mine. I'm right there with you. But I feel like the conversations that we're having now, and the level of conversation, and also just the vibe, and like just so many things, I feel like while I love the title of 6-figure influencer and it has served me so well, it has caught so many of your attention, which is not lost on me and is a reason why I haven't changed it yet, because it's a really big decision. I just don't feel like it gives justice to the level of conversations that we're having now. I think before it made sense. But when I hear, I mean, just the word influencer, when I hear the word influencer, I don't think of what I do. Now, can it be argued that I'm an influencer and you're an influencer and we're all like, if you show up on your social media and you share anything and it influences somebody's buying decision, you're technically an influencer. So can we argue? Yes. But when I hear the word influencer, it is not me that I think of. I think of, like Loverly Gray, right? Who was just on the podcast, who is so wildly, incredibly successful and an incredible business owner. But we have totally different businesses and business models. There are similarities, but her revenue, the bulk of her revenue are from brand deals and from commissions, from the content that she shares. And that's like typically that's what I think of when I think of an influencer. And I think most of you would agree. That's not how I generate revenue in my business. We both create content. That's like the main probably revenue driver in our business is content. And I talk about that a lot, but not exactly it. So if I could go back in time, I would try and think of a title that could stand the test of time. Because if you're going to start a podcast, you need to be in it for the long game. It's rare unless you're coming to the table with a built-in, like insanely engaged audience and, you're already kind of a household name. Unless you're coming to the table with that already, it's going to take some time for you to build some traction, as with anything worth building, So knowing that, you want to pick a title that can evolve with you, because while you think you might do the thing that you're doing right now for a business forever, if you're like most people, your business is going to evolve right alongside you. Some people don't. Some people, they find their thing and they stick with it forever because they figured it out really early. For me, I mean, look how much my business has evolved. And if you're new around here, I started as a social media expert. And now social media is a big part of that because that's the place that I grow my business. But the conversations, I mean, I rarely coach on it anymore. It's part of it. It's a facet, but that is not what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about helping women build businesses and lives of their dreams. And we talk about the mindset of that and the business strategy, how to build a business around that, which yes, includes social media. So yeah, I think if I could go back, I would try really hard to pick something that can evolve. Now, if you are picking a title for yourself right now, here's how I'm coming at it. If I do change the name of the podcast, that might help you. And I don't know if I'm going to, because of course, now that I'm really considering this, we're gaining this traction. It's like, oh gosh, is this even smart to change the title? And there's pros and cons to both. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. But if I were to change the title, this is how I'm coming at it now. Number one, can this title grow with me? Is it general enough to where it still alludes to what we talk about to the vibe of the conversation, and when people see it, like they get it, and it can grow with you. It's not pigeonholing you in this one very, very specific niche, unless again, you're so certain that that's where you want to live. So you want to think about it from that. And what's going to get attention? Like I said, there are so many podcasts out there, thousands and thousands and thousands of podcasts out there. The title is very important. And this is why some people have asked me, why not just name it the Allie Reeves Show? Which I've thought of that. And I love that because I'm me and I love me, and everybody wants to use your own name. But would people see that and get it? And I'm not going anywhere, God willing. So eventually I'll be a household name and people will know, just like the Oprah show, just like the Ed Milet show. People will see that and be like, oh, Allie Reeves. Yeah. And that's evolutionable. But are we there yet? I don't know. I don't know. So yeah. So it needs to be able to grow with you and juicy enough to get people's attention. That's the way I'm coming at this. And I asked you all on my stories over on Instagram for ideas like, hey, if you listen to the podcast regularly, what would you title it? Like, what words come to mind? And the amount of genius that came through in those suggestions, I am so freaking grateful. Thank you so much. And I've screenshot them all. And I think I'm going to take like a hiatus and take like a day or two and really dream on this and like really take it seriously and decide if I'm going to change it because it's a big deal. But I just wanted to, if you sent in an idea, I just wanted to thank you. I just haven't had a chance to think of it because the ideas were so good. So that would be number one. Okay. Title, something that grows with you. The second thing, if I could go back in time and change anything about the podcast or how I've been showing up or my strategy with the podcast, I would do more collaborations. I would. And I've done very few. I've had some people on and they've been incredible. And I am so intentional about who I put on the podcast because I am a consumer of other podcasts. I listen to them just like so many of you do, other podcasts. And there's some podcasts that are so interview heavy. And unless you're Joe Rogan, where like that's your thing, in a lot of cases, it gets on my nerves. In a lot of cases, like I'd rather a solo episode. Like if I vibe with the person of the podcast, the host of the podcast, unless again, it's just their thing, like that's their formula for the podcast where like they're an interview show. Unless that's the situation, I usually prefer solo episodes personally. So you see a lot of podcasts that are like super, super interview heavy. And because that's not my favorite, I've been really, really mindful about who I bring on this show and who I feature on here. So that's been part of it, which I'm happy that I do that. And I will always, always do that. But I will say part of it has been laziness too, because like I've shared, me doing this podcast, it hasn't always been easy. It's in a lot of weeks, especially like the first 2 years of the podcast, I was also growing a brand new business all by myself. I didn't have any support really. And the podcast, it wasn't my number one priority. I was dedicated to it and I showed up faithfully and I gave it the best that I could at the time. But it took everything in me to sit down and just get an episode out and sent to my team, let alone setting up a collaboration and booking a time and going back and forth on what we're going to talk about and getting their bios and then like, podcast promotions afterward. And, whenever you bring somebody else into the picture, there's a lot of other things that you kind of have to get that I've learned. So for a while, I was like, I'm just not going to do interviews because I don't have the energy to do them. Now, in hindsight, now that I've gained some traction and I've done a few interviews that were super intentional, that like, regardless of their audience, I would have brought them on anyway. But a few of the people that I've brought on recently have had insanely engaged audiences, and being able to cross promote with those people and getting more of their people's eyeballs on my stuff, in addition to more downloads, all of this helps you rank more. It kind of gains you more traction and gets me in front of more of the right people, which is beautiful, right? So it's kind of like scaling your efforts a little bit. So if I were to go back in time, I would do a few more collaborations for sure. But of course, it would still be through the lens of, does this, like, is is my audience going to be excited about this person? Am I doing this for my people, or am I doing this for downloads? And if it's not going to serve you in like the utmost way, then and moving, I mean, that's just my vibe, period. Because the last thing I want is for you to stop listening to this because you think that I'm just trying to get people on for downloads. No, absolutely not. Not the vibe. And again, I've seen other people do that, and I see how I feel about that. So I'm not going to do that to myself, and I'm not going to do that to you. You're welcome. So that's the second thing. I would be more intentional with collaborations. And the third thing, if I could go back in time, the third thing that I would do differently is I would be a bit more intentional promoting each episode early on. This is only something that I've started doing like super intentionally. I kid you not, the past couple months, which is wild. So let's say like prior to 2022, I've already shared, it was enough just to like sit down and record. It was just like the thing. I was dedicated to it, but it wasn't easy to do. It took the time. And so then, the episode would be out, and I would mention it, I would share about it maybe once in stories. I would maybe do a post referring to the episode and pointing people back to it. But I wasn't getting graphics made. I could have been so much more intentional. And the reason why I would change that now is because, why am I doing this if I'm not making sure people see it? And there were people subscribed. So if you're subscribed to the podcast, you're seeing that there's a new episode. But there were so many new people in my world that didn't even realize that I had a podcast, or maybe weren't subscribed yet. Like, I don't know if y'all sometimes listen to random episodes, but then you forget to subscribe to a podcast. I do that all the time, which, by the way, go subscribe to my podcast, please, if you haven't yet. It's really easy to forget. But yeah, there's so many people in my world that the way that I promoted it, the lax nature that I promoted it, it so easily just flew right under the radar. I have no doubt. And I was putting out the best content that I possibly could. It wasn't easy for me, but like I've always poured my heart and soul into these episodes, like the best that I possibly could at the time. So if you're going to do that with anything, whether it's a podcast, whether it's with a TikTok, whether it's with a blog, anything, like, why are you pouring your energy into it if you're not going to promote it and let people know that it's there? So that doesn't mean we have to run ads or do anything crazy, but I just know, I could have been so much more intentional for the first 2 years of the podcast in promoting. And if I had, I know that I can safely assume that there would be even more traction right now. So anyway, those are the three things that, again, if I could just go back in time, I would reconsider. So if you are new or you're considering starting a podcast, learn from my mistakes, create the name that can evolve with you. be super intentional about collaborations, but understand how it absolutely serves your people and your goal of being discovered by more people, and take the time to promote your episodes, whether that just be in your own other content on social media, in your stories. You don't have to pay for somebody to make fancy graphics for you unless you want to. And in that case, why not? That would, make your job a lot easier. But like you can absolutely do it yourself. But like if you're going to go for it, go for it. Give it your all, or to the best of your ability. And that those are the things that I would do a little differently. So I hope this served you. If so, let me know. And yeah, if you like this, if you like this vibe, if you're a newer podcast, or you just haven't kind of found your stride yet, or an aspiring podcast and you're really trying to figure out when to pull the trigger and when to do it, or if you're even going to start one, join us this Thursday for the masterclass. It's free. It's going to be super juicy, super honest. And I'm going to share with you the 3 codes to unlock your chart ranking podcast. The 3 things that I know have helped me gain this traction to actually start charting to top 100 on Apple's business podcasts. We've peaked at 85. That's a really big deal. Like if you look at all the podcasts, and hitting number 15 for Apple's entrepreneurship chart. These are like big numbers. And again, like, what does that mean? Nothing except that it helps me be discovered. It's like a big sales funnel for my business. And it allows me to get my work and my words and the things that I really believe in to more people, which I know that you want too. So that's going to be the vibe of the masterclass. And I'm really, really excited to offer that to you. So I hope to see you there. Again, if you listen to this after the fact, go to the link in the show notes, because we're doing something with the recording, or you can reach out to me anytime on Instagram at LEI Reeves, and we'll get you all those things as well. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If so, let me know. I love you so much, and I will see you hopefully in the masterclass or here next week. Bye.